Hello, my name is Frank Lough. I'm from the University of Birmingham, and today I want to share some thoughts on the question of national identity and Spanish Republic in exile. In many ways, exile is a difficult notion and one which needs some definition in whichever context it's used. It's been applied to the human condition, to different life experiences, and to very specific historical events, such as the mass exodus of many Spaniards from their homeland during and after the Civil War of 1936 to 1939, what we commonly refer to as Spanish Republic in exile. We might begin by taking as an example John Simpson's introduction to the Oxford Book of Exile, in which the historically specific is seen as a manifestation of a universal existential experience. I won't read all of this, but I've highlighted two key passages from it. Simpson says, for example, that we are exiled from our mother's womb, from our childhood, from private happiness, from peace, even if we are not exiles in the more conventional sense of the word. He then says, it is the human condition, and the great upheavals of history have merely added physical expression to an inner fact. Now, one of the inherent dangers of attempting to define exile in a way which encompasses all of human life are that it becomes too abstract and glosses over the actual realities of the individual human experience, and that, as a consequence, it minimises the importance of the historical conditions in which it takes place. The challenge, as was once suggested by Claudio Guillén, is to recognise both the structural similarities between different experiences of exile across time and space, and the historical specificity of these experiences. Discussions of exile have often focused on issues related to the nation, nationalism, cultural nationalism, and national identity, for example. According to Sophia McClellan, much writing about exile is based on the argument that a nation has a common culture and that this culture has unique qualities that should be maintained. The key problem with this idea of cultural nationalism, as McClellan goes on to argue, is that it's a form of cultural essentialism which does not explain why in any context there can be conflicting versions of it. The answer, in part, according to Sebastian Faber and others, is that the idea of a shared national identity is an illusion, one which can only be maintained as long as it is expressed indirectly in vague and abstract terms, and that, following Glenn Bowman, it is the product of a synecdochical projection in which certain parts of the national community or way of life that are seen as privileged or especially symbolic are made to stand in for the whole. Now, national identity may be an illusion, but it is a necessary one in the creation of communities. The stronger the bond between the members of a community, the stronger is their sense of belonging and therefore acceptance of the illusion. In the years leading up to the Spanish Civil War, the bonds of community were particularly weak, and as Faber and others have indicated, the war was at bottom a conflict over Spanish national identity, or what it meant to be Spanish, with both sides deeming the other to be either anti-Spanish or non-Spanish. When considering the experiences of Spanish Republican exiles, it's important to understand not only the nature of the cultural essentialism which they represented or sought to represent, but also the historical conditions which helped shape this representation. As McClellan notes, the condition of exile is directly a result of the social and political climate occupied by the author, making ahistorical exile literature a contradiction in terms. And where she talks about literature, I think we could talk about any cultural production. McClellan's focus is on three writers, Cristina Peri Rossi, Ariel Dorfman, and Juan Goytisolo, who, regardless of their nationalities, were all of an older generation than the artists, writers and intellectuals associated with Spanish Republic in exile. They represent for her many of exiled writers from other countries in different parts of the world in the late 20th century. Now, this means that the historical conditions under which they were writing were very different from those of the earlier generation, but the differences which McClellan briefly refers to, I think, can be useful and instructive. The historical conditions which shaped much exile writing in the late 20th century, according to McClellan, pertain to changes which began to be brought about throughout the 1960s and 1970s as a result of increasing globalisation, the demise of the nation-state, and the emergence of post-structuralism and postmodernism. McClellan charts the changing relationship between the subject and the state from the pre-modern era to the late 20th century, from an identification between subject and state to a fracturing of that sense of identity. In the shift from the pre-modern era to one of modernisation, she argues, the inception of nationalism was central to the formation of modern nations because it describes the inalienable ties between the subject and the state. Nevertheless, while nationalism projected a unified national body as part of its ideological persuasion, such unification rarely, if ever, existed. And I think we're reminded here of Benedict Anderson's notion of imagined communities, and is one of the reasons why the idea of a shared national identity is in fact an illusion. The rise of the nation-state is in itself intimately linked with industrialisation, a process which in the modernist period leads to increasing alienation of the self. As McClellan says, in modernism, alienation is an unpleasant and painful experience. Much cultural production during modernism then demonstrates the self's alienation from the rise of the city and from the increasing entrenchment of modern society. The historical circumstances of the late 20th century are very different, in that the bourgeois obsession with representing the anxiety of the alienated self under modernism was abandoned in favour of a radical re-articulation of the self as endlessly splintered and different. At the same time, the link between the exile's alienation and nationalism is no longer desirable because, as McClellan says, the individual's allegiance to a nation is considered to be oppressive. McClellan's framing of her discussion offers several pointers to issues which are useful in any discussion of Spanish Republican exiles and their relationship to the nation and national identity. The modernist identification between subject and state, the alienation of the modern self in the light of increased industrialisation, and crucially, the specific historical context of the slow development of Spain as a nation-state in the 19th and early 20th centuries. It is this last issue in particular which is especially relevant given the generally accepted view of the Civil War as a struggle over the issue of Spanish national identity. The Spanish Civil War of 1936 to 1939 is generally accepted to be the most significant event in the history of Spain in the 20th century. While it can be seen as one more stage in a long history of division within Spain, which can easily be traced back to the beginning of the 19th century, to the Napoleonic invasion, the declaration of the Constitution of Cadiz, and the start of a long political struggle between conservative and liberal forces throughout the 19th century, Anthony Beevor suggests that its roots lie even further back in time, in the days of the Catholic monarchs and the creation of the modern Spanish state. He described it as the event which signalled the greatest clash in the conflict of forces which had dominated Spanish history, a conflict which he says has three strands: class interests, authoritarian rule against libertarian instinct, and central government against regionalist aspirations. The genesis of these three strains of conflict, he says, lay in the way the Reconquista of Spain from the Moors had shaped the social structure of the country and formed the attitudes of the Castilian conquerors. And there is of course a direct link between the values of the Catholic monarchs and the Nationalist alliance, which continually evoked the glory of Ferdinand and Isabella and referred to their own struggle as the Second Reconquista, with liberals, Reds and separatists allotted the role of the contemporary heathen. Now, one of the clear implications of all of this is that not only has the modern Spanish state been fraught with division since the moment of its creation, but also that these divisions did not allow for the creation of a stable and lasting sense of identity in which all, or at least a majority of Spaniards, could share. While we may identify two main ideological forces which have lain behind many of the conflicts in the history of Spain, we also have to recognise that each of these had different configurations which changed over time. For example, during the almost 50 years of the Restoration at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th centuries, the Liberal pact with the Conservatives to alternate in power meant that the Liberal agenda of this period was much more conservative than that outlined in the Constitution of Cádiz of 1812. As Francisco Romero Salvador has noted, the Restoration was an oligarchic system which by its very nature, conserving important remnants of the Ancien Régime, obstructed and delayed the birth of a modern nation-state. Real power was monopolised by two monarchist and dynastic parties, Conservatives and Liberals. They were not modern political formations, but groups of notables and professional politicians who guaranteed the political supremacy of the financial landowning oligarchies of the country. This political agreement, in terms of sharing power, however, did not pave the way for the creation of a sense of a shared national identity. If anything, this became all the more difficult due to the very slow modernisation of the country and the slow formation of Spain as a nation-state, and specifically the end of Spain's colonial power after the disaster of 1898. Having noted that the Spanish nation-building process during the 19th century was slower and less thorough than in most other Western European countries, Eric Storm suggests that specifically there was no attempt at what he termed the nationalisation of the masses. If anything, he says, the cacique system which helped to maintain the system of turns benefited from preventing such progress. A policy of nation building, that is, of stimulating the national consciousness and at the same time the political awareness of the population, would in fact be counterproductive, as it would make it more difficult to control the elections and remain in power. Indeed, María del Mar Pozo Andrés and Antonio Francisco Canales Serrano have argued that Conservatives and regionalists, together with part of the Catholic Church, believed in a Spain with plural identities in which the love for the Patria Chica would lead directly to an identification with the Patria Grande, and that there was no need for a policy of nationalisation through education, as the Church and the monarchy sufficed to sustain the idea of the nation. This obviously in marked contrast to the conservative position held by Franco after the Spanish Civil War. According to Sebastian Balfour, for much of its history, any sense of unity in Spain was built around the country's colonial power. After 1898, one of the legacies of the disaster was that there was no positive image of the nation with which the people could identify. So the already fragile consensus on which the Restoration had been based was disintegrating. The capacity of the state to exert political and ideological hegemony or to co-opt newly emergent interest groups had been considerably weakened by the war and the loss of the colonies. This same view is supported by Storm when he notes that as a common colonial enterprise could not unify the nation from 1898 onwards, internal discords became more prominent and were hard to overcome. This lack of a common national identity was manifest at a symbolic level, as at the end of the 19th century, unlike most other European countries, Spain had no uncontested national flag, national anthem or national holiday, and little was done to embellish the capital or to honour national heroes. As Balfour suggests, therefore, in the context of modernisation, no matter how slow it was, the crisis of legitimacy in the wake of the disaster was also a crisis of identity, in which there grew a plurality of identities in more developed parts of Spain, replacing traditional self-images with new perceptions of regional class and identities. Now, initial attempts by the political class to begin to unify the nation in the first decade of the 20th century by nationalising the masses through education and suffrage were undermined by the violence of the Semana Trágica of 1909 and the shooting of the Prime Minister José Canalejas by the anarchist Manuel Pardiñas in 1912, both events which provoked distrust and fear amongst the ruling classes. According to Storm, further attempts at nation building only really became possible with the advent of the Second Republic, but by then, as is well known, the tensions between the two main conflicting forces within Spain had become extreme, to the extent that, as Storm suggests, compromise was no longer possible. This inability to compromise was evident in the series of political crises which plagued the successive governments from 1931 until 1936, and the increased use of violence, both by the state and on the streets. In the 4 months which followed the success of the Popular Front elections of the 16th of February 1936, Anthony Beevor reports that by the 16th of June, 1 month before the military rebellion which sparked the Civil War, 170 churches had been burned, 269 murders had been committed, and 1,287 people injured. Altogether, 133 general strikes and 216 local strikes had been called. Now, although Beevor states that many of these statistics may not be entirely reliable, he does conclude that they did nothing to contradict the general impression that Spain was becoming ungovernable. What is important to underline, however, is that while following Beevor it is possible to chart a major division in the makeup of the Spanish state from its very beginnings, this can only be understood at a general and abstract level, with each historical moment having its own specific context. The reality is that neither of these two main ideological forces consisted of groups which fully shared either an ideological or political agenda, or a clear idea of Spain beyond the most general characterization. Throughout the 1930s, for example, there were clear internal divisions on both sides. The emergence of the Popular Front in the elections of February 1936 provided a precarious unity to the left, which, when it began to dissolve, would eventually undermine the war effort. On the right, on the other hand, Franco succeeded in achieving unity through agreement in the first instance, and eventually, in the longer term, through political guile and coercion. As the Civil War began, many people were forced or felt compelled to take sides, at times as a means of self-preservation, and some to set aside their differences in order to find common ground as a means of increasing their political power. At the same time, the various positions became polarised so that both within Spain and beyond, the complexities which underlay the conflict were simplified and presented as a battle between communism and fascism. This Manichaean model of communism versus fascism, victors against victims, good and bad, inevitably dominated much of the discourse on both sides during the war, and it was continued openly by Franco's government for many years afterwards. I think it's also clear to see that it also dominated a lot of discussion about Spain's history during the period of the transition to democracy after the death of Franco in 1975, and in some areas continues to do so today. However, just as exile can be considered in terms of structural similarities and different specific historical context, the same applies to discussions of civil wars. Writing on the logic of violence and civil wars in different countries around the world and across the centuries, Stathis Kalivas has argued that the assumption is that elites determine automatically and unilaterally the course of group actions, and that groups are monolithic and behave as such. This shortcut is perhaps necessary when narrating the story of a specific civil war, but it is, he says, problematic, and therefore clearly the relation between political actors and underlying populations must be problematized rather than assumed away. Edward Malefakis has also argued that in every civil war the majority of the population probably belongs, at least at the beginning of the conflict, to something equivalent to what came to be called in the Spanish Civil War, the Third Spain. People who did not believe in any cause with sufficient intensity as to be willing to shed blood for it. In Spain, many people left as the war progressed to avoid being caught up in the conflict, while many others chose or were forced to take sides. Laura de Foredels echoes Malefakis' point when she notes that, the term civil war conjures up the image of a country divided in two, but the Spanish Civil War, and perhaps all civil wars, was far more multifaceted. Often mythologized as the last great cause, particularly by the West, the Spanish Civil War was actually an intricate coagulation of splits between town and country, constitutionalists and Carlists, New and Old Spain, communists and fascists, clericals and anti-clericals. To sum up then, while many saw the Spanish Civil War principally as a struggle between two competing ideologies with global ambitions, communism and fascism, neither of which was inherently Spanish, it was also a conflict about the very essence of Spain itself and what it meant to be Spanish. But a conflict waged by two sides, each of which represented a coalition of different ideas and attitudes held by different groups in a country which before the conflict had not fully developed as a modern nation state and which had never succeeded in finding a unifying sense of identity. At the end of the war, with the imposition of Franco's dictatorship, it was the more conservative brand of Spanishness which was imposed on the country, one which excluded entirely any contribution from those who went into exile. This is not to say, of course, that everyone who remained in Spain identified with it, simply that the regime's way of resolving the century-old issue was to attempt, unsuccessfully in many ways, to impose the idea of a single identity on the nation. According to Eric Hobsbawm, the new Spain identified itself as a break with the Republican one, but at the same time it set itself up as the sole representative of eternal Spain. Thus, the regime's propaganda constantly referred to the historical ancestry of this new Spain, and by means of the invention of a tradition sought an effective historical continuity for itself. While all forms of national identity or cultural nationalism may be seen to be necessary inventions which operate in subtle ways, the new Spain promoted by Franco, as is the case with most authoritarian regimes, blatantly promoted a false image which distorted or simply falsified history. Above all, though, it was, according to Hobsbawm, invented because it appropriated historical events, mythicised them and endowed them with new, eminently ritual and symbolic functions. The regime's essentialist Catholic rhetoric with regard to Spanish identity was, according to David Hertzberger, epitomised in the words of the writer and member of the Real Academia Española, Federico García Sánchez, who commented in 1945 that Spain is the only country in history where there cannot be, nor has there been, nor is there any difference between moral and religious character, because in Spain the Hispanic and the Christian are united, and they come to form a consubstantial whole. One cannot be Spanish and not be Catholic, because if one is not a Catholic, one cannot be Spanish. Whoever says that he is Spanish and not a Catholic does not know what he is saying. Clearly, imposition of such an image of Spain does not guarantee agreement or identification with it on the part of all those who remained in the country. Rather, it can lead to a sense of alienation, and this is what effectively lies at the root of the notion of an inner exile as proposed by Paul Elie. The image of Spain constructed by Franco's regime was openly essentialist and therefore deemed to be timeless. It was an image which sought to freeze time by fusing past and present, and suggesting that no essential change would be required in the future. It is an easy image to define because it was carefully crafted rather than something which emerged organically or which was internalised by the majority of Spaniards over time. It was also actively promoted in speeches, writing and legislation, taught in schools, and represented symbolically in public spaces through, for example, through art and architecture. Now, I don't want to go into this in much detail because I think a lot is already known about it, but I think it's useful to look at one or two examples just to help illustrate the point. The first example is the very carefully composed portrait of Franco painted in 1940 by Fernando Álvarez de Sotomayor, which recalls several features which link him with Spain's imperial past. According to Miriam Basilio, it was inspired by Titian's painting of Charles V at the Battle of Mühlberg, recalls the images of Santiago Matamoros and previous royal portraits, such as Velázquez's painting of Queen Isabella from 1599-1600. Again, I won't read this, but the quotation there simply draws out the comparisons in a little bit more detail. A second example we might draw is from the many examples of an imperial style of architecture which is reflected in many of the public buildings which were erected in Spain after the Spanish Civil War. For example, the Air Ministry in Moncloa, which was designed by Luis Gutiérrez Soto and built between 1942 and 1951, which was clearly styled after the Escorial Palace, which was built for Philip II between 1563 and 1584. The need to impose an image or an idea of national identity is a clear indication of the lack of the communal bonds required to create a sense of belonging. Its essentialist nature is forcefully delegitimized by Stuart Hall's widely accepted contention that cultural identity is not a fixed essence at all, lying unchanged outside history and culture. It is not some universal and transcendental spirit inside us on which history has made no fundamental mark. It is not once and for all. It is not a fixed origin to which we can make some final and absolute return. When we come to consider the image of Spain and the idea of Spanish identity presented by those in exile, the picture is much more complex. On the one hand, the varied experiences, attitudes and ideas of those in exile, in addition to their dispersal across different countries and continents, would have made any cohesive image or idea of Spain difficult to maintain. More importantly, however, if no cohesive sense of Spanish identity existed in either camp before the war, none was likely to emerge afterwards in the context of the diaspora. One might even argue that the legacy of a variety of identities based on the patriarchia still survives today, as in many cases the many foundations and institutions which have been set up since the transition to democracy to honour many of the writers and intellectuals who went into exile have been sponsored and financed by regional rather than national institutions. As Sebastian Faber has clearly shown in his study of the Spanish intellectuals in Mexico, both the exile and the culture of the host nation can have an impact on each other in various ways, and this impact can change over time due to changing political circumstances. So what we see in Spanish Republican exiles is the attempt to forge new identities in a new social, political and cultural context. And these are identities which will inevitably be shaped to some degree by the exile's cultural heritage. This gives rise to a situation in which exile identity becomes a site of tension in which three potential images of Spain might come into play. That of Franco's Spain, a more liberal image associated with the democratic politics of the Second Republic and the third is the reality of the new identity being forged in exile. It's worth underlining here, however, that unlike Franco's definable image of Spain and Spanishness, there was no clear defined image of Spain or idea of Spanish as shared by those who went into exile beyond the broad ideological idea of liberalism and democracy. The advent of the Second Republic created a space in Spain within which left-leaning and liberal forces had the opportunity to begin to create a new image of Spain, one which would challenge the centralist, military and religious leanings of an old Spain they sought to replace. This still leaves us with the question, however, what was the specific historical context in which it was expected that this new image of Spain might be forged? If we return to McClellan's ideas about the relationship between self and the nation, it seems clear that if a modern sense of national identity is linked to the emergence of nationalism, Spain's slow progress in emerging as a modern nation or a modern nation state made it difficult for such an identity to be forged in the 19th century or the early decades of the 20th. The ground on which any new image of Spain which many hoped to construct during the Second Republic to replace the old imperialist image was both unstable and contradictory. On the one hand, the idea was intended to be progressive and forward-looking, while on the other, its promoters struggled to break down class divisions and were still influenced by a residual romantic mode of thought which, in the context of a weak nation state and low levels of industrialisation, continued to dominate many areas of art and intellectual life. Several critics working in different areas have noted romantic traces in a whole range of Spanish authors from the late 19th into the early 20th century. I won't go into that in any detail at the moment, but significantly, José Díaz Fernández published El Nuevo Romanticismo in 1930. And as we are here to talk specifically about Gerhardt in the context of music, it's worth throwing in just one observation by Julian White on Spanish music. White says that the late development in Spain of symphonic romanticism and romantic nationalism reflects the essentially anachronistic nature of early 20th century Spanish music. Its belated modernisation after a long period of stagnation was largely due to the pioneering efforts of Felipe Pedrell, the patriarch of the Spanish musical renaissance and the mentor of two generations of Spanish composers. But perhaps one of the clearest links to an underlying romantic mode of thought is the use of the term pueblo throughout the Second Republic, and also by those on the Republican side during the Civil War. As Joe Labagna and Helen Graham have noted, the term popular culture, as the expression of the people or folk, is a romantic coinage, inescapably linked to the liberal projection of nation building which sought to incorporate the rural population into the modern state in an attempt to make the people and the nation coincide. Labagna then notes that despite the best intentions, most Republican intellectuals were unable to get beyond an implicit cultural paternalism, as evidenced by their overwhelming preference for the term pueblo, compared to German Volk, to the Marxist term Massas, whose use was largely restricted to grassroots labour organisations. The romantic connotations of the term pueblo also link directly, of course, to the events of May 1808 and the origins of the myth of the pueblo as defenders of the nation, a conceit that was often referred to during the war and is the subject of Rafael Alberti's play Noche de Guerra en el Museo, written in exile in 1956. It also resonates with the idea of a rural rather than city-based industrial economy. Not only was this a reflection of the fact that Spain was still predominantly an agrarian economy in the 1930s, but it fed into the same image of Spain which had been constructed during the Romantic period by other European nations when Spain came to represent an exotic pre-modern paradise. Álvarez Junco talks of, for example, revolutionary terror, political instability, the empire of mercantile values, all of which produced a critical reaction. In artistic and intellectual circles, it became fashionable to distance oneself from the more moral cynicism and aesthetic mediocrity of the so-called bourgeois Philistine. Modern society was boring. Many were affected by the spleen, le mal du siècle. Spain, conveniently idealised as a paradise still untouched by industrialisation, urbanisation and capitalism, offered the image of a country loyal to its identity. A slightly ironic turn of phrase, if you like, in the sense that the identity that is being talked about here is an identity which is in the process of construction. And it's an identity that only made sense as a construct composed of all of those elements which European visitors sought to escape. Nonetheless, it also became part of the Spanish imaginary, as Álvarez Junco further notes. He says, "There is something in which both Spaniards and non-Spaniards certainly agreed by the middle of the 19th century, that there was such a thing as a Spanish identity, a Spanish character, a Spanish soul or essence with very definitive traits. The Spanish way of being was, in fact, one of the stereotypes most widely accepted among European collective identities of that period. This international recognition concurred with a similar internal acceptance." What's notable here, however, is that this sense of a real Spanish identity was actually contradicted on the ground in the context of Spain and its development as a nation. The most significant example of this romantic image of Spain which was being constructed is perhaps the Carmen myth, which was first inspired by Prosper Mérimé's novel of 1845 and then by Bizet's opera of the same name from 1875. A key element of both being the Españolada, which was popular in Spain before the Civil War and actively promoted later by Franco as a way of both entertaining Spaniards and presenting a positive image of the country. Writing on Carlos Saura's film Carmen from 1983, Marvin de Lugo states that, the essential point of Saura's archaeological recouping of the sources of the Carmen myth is a very contemporary one. Spaniards, having come under the spell of the foreign, imposed impressions of Spain, find themselves seduced by this falsification of their own cultural past." End of quote. In the context of the literature of Spanish Republican exiles, Ramon J. Sender offers a different but connected image. During the Second Republic, Sender was one of the few writers to talk of the masses rather than just the people. His pre-Civil War novels were mostly set in urban environments and fully engaged with Spain's recent history and the need for social and political change. His writing in exile, however, like that of many others, became more autobiographical and increasingly depoliticized. Sender himself famously said once that he had ceased to write a literatura de combate in favour of a literatura de iluminación. However, there is one constant in many of his novels, from his very first novel Imanen in 1930 onwards, and that is the romanticised image of the uneducated peasant whose understanding of the world and belief in social justice is intuitive. This is the case, for example, of Paco, the protagonist of what is probably Sender's most well-known post-Civil War novel, Requiem por un campesino español. On the one hand, as I've argued elsewhere, during the Second Republic, Sender was attempting to provide an answer to the vexed question of how bourgeois intellectuals and the pueblo could work together, by showing how social and political ideas could be accessed in different ways and shared. On the other hand, Sender's idealised peasant can also be seen as a highly romanticised representation of the pueblo, the embodiment of a rural ideal. And it is this version which takes precedence in Sender's novels written in exile, as the conviction grows that the political ideals of the Republic had been lost. Now, I began by alluding to the idea that exile is a difficult notion to define. This is also the case with notions of national identity, which are generally selective in their narratives, myths, ideas, and the symbols on which they depend. The development of an idea of belonging, or the internalisation of patterns of thought, emotions, and symbolic meanings, which a shared sense of national identity requires, is generally a slow, often subconscious process. Authoritarian regimes, on the other hand, adopt much more conscious mechanisms of control, which purposefully alienate some part of their population. And this was clearly the case with Franco's regime after the Civil War. For the exiles, however, the defeat of the Republic meant the loss of an opportunity to begin to develop a new sense of Spanish identity, which was based on ideas and values which some shared and which had some degree of historical legitimacy. But it was also a national identity which did not materialise in any meaningful or lasting way. Exile meant the defeat of democracy in Spain and the loss of the communal bonds on which any potential new national identity might have been built. And for many years, while some like Sender abandoned hope, others maintained faith in the possibility of a return and the opportunity to pick up where they had left off. What most exiles shared, to some degree, was a belief in some form of liberalism and democracy as the means by which any new national identity could be achieved for Spain. Unlike Franco's newly constructed national image, which sought to merge past, present and future in a timeless essence, many exiles became increasingly aware that with the passage of time they had been robbed of the future that they sought to build, and this left them only with their past, which many explored in their writings, and, as Maripaz Balibrea and others have shown, a present in which they found themselves increasingly out of phase with the reality of Spanish society in the 1960s and 1970s, the consequence of what has been termed the destiempo of the exile. Given the situation of Spain at the beginning of the 20th century, a limited sense of the alienation associated with the development of the modern nation state and limited industrialisation, which allowed for the perpetuation of pre-modern and romantic notions of an identity between self and state, and in the Spanish case often between the self and the patria chica, it's perhaps not surprising that, unlike their later counterparts discussed by McClellan, many Spanish Republican exiles primarily attempted to represent the Civil War through autobiographical narratives like Rosa Chacel's Desde el Amanecer, Sender's Crónica del Alba, and Arturo Barea La Forja de un Rebelde. What has been a point of contention in the last 20 years or so is the way in which exiles and those who remained in Spain may or may not have helped pave the way for the transition to democracy after Franco's death in 1975. This is a very different issue to the one I've been discussing, but the very fact that this is a point of contention, that there is a debate about what constitutes the form or forms of liberalism which contributed to the construction of Spain's present democracy and to the ongoing construction of some form of national identity, is one indication among many that the issue of Spanish identity, which was not resolved during the Second Republic by Franco's Spain or by those in exile, still remains a highly contentious issue today. Thank you.